Hi, this is Steve Platek for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. Today I'm speaking with David Bjorklund, professor of psychology at Florida Atlantic University and one of the founders or key players in the development of evolutionary developmental psychology. Hi, David. How you doing?
Hi, Steve. Very good. How about yourself?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for being with us. The
My
first,
pleasure.
the first thing I'd like to ask you is, how did you become interested in the evolutionary perspective to behavioral science?
Well, it started in graduate school. I did my graduate work at University of North Carolina in the topic of memory development, which has nothing to do, at least at that time, with evolutionary psychology. But one of the seminars I had was taught by Gilbert Gottlieb, at least a third of a seminar. And he has a very interesting perspective, a developmental systems perspective, as it's called now. But part of that was the role of development in evolution. And this just caught my attention. I thought it was really fascinating. And I did nothing with it for the next 10, 15 years or so, at least not professionally. But my beach reading was Stephen Jay Gould or Richard Dawkins. I kept very interested in the topic of evolution. And when mainstream evolutionary psychology came along, when David Buss and Tooby and Cosmides started publishing their work, I saw an opportunity to integrate some of my things I've been reading on the side and my interest in development together. And so I thought I'd write one or two papers showing how this integrates very nicely. And I learned very quickly it's not that simple. It's much more complicated than I thought. And so for the last 20, maybe 25 years, maybe not exclusively, but starting about 25 years ago probably, I've been working on these questions, these issues, and just haven't stopped.
Wonderful, wonderful. What are your graduate students? You have graduate students down there, FAU, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've got 8 or 9 of them right now.
Oh, that's fantastic. Now, do you find that students who are applying the study with you are already very familiar with the evolutionary approach, or is it something that they're, like you, that they're trying to delve into for the first time?
Well, most of the students who come to work with me now are very much informed about evolutionary psychology. But that wasn't necessarily the case in the beginning.
Right.
So my early students, very few did their research with an evolutionary bent. But slowly topics became, almost every topic came to have an evolutionary orientation of one way or another. So I'm still consider myself a cognitive developmental psychologist. That's still I'm a developmentalist first. But most of the topics that I'm investigating now and that my students are investigating have an evolutionary bent to it. So one student just finished her PhD, Amy Gardner, and was doing work on tool use and imitation, taking an evolutionary perspective on their development in both cases. Another PhD student who's finishing up is looking at economic game theory a little bit and sharing, the development of cooperation and sharing in an economic type game that has a very definite evolutionary perspective. I never thought I would get involved in this, but I started looking, some of my students became interested in children's belief in the supernatural and ghosts and spirits, and how this may have emerged from theory of mind, which takes a very explicit evolutionary perspective. So a lot of topics that are traditional in cognitive development, such as theory of mind, imitation, social learning, tool use, my students and I have been approaching them from an evolutionary perspective, taking a little different twist on things than I certainly would have several years ago, a number of years ago.
Excellent. One of the things that you mentioned, I mean, all the things that you mentioned sound absolutely fascinating. One of the things that has caught my attention is this idea of children's belief in the supernatural. Here in Georgia Gwinnett College, we have a very active student, it's all undergraduate institution. We have this undergraduate club called the Science History Club, which recently had a lecture, sort of a debate about belief-centered reality. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit about your work on children's belief in the supernatural and its relation to theory of mind.
Well, it started with my graduate student, someone who I know, Jesse Baring, when he was finishing his PhD with me. and he was the one who got me interested in this topic. And for his dissertation, he did a study looking at the development of children's afterlife beliefs. What happens when, not children themselves necessarily, but in this experimental case, an anthropomorphized mouse dies. Does he still smell the flowers? Is he still sick to his stomach? Does he still love his mother? You know, basic questions like that. And we found some very interesting things, that even 4 and 5-year-olds have some understanding of biological death, that the mind stops working, that the mouse will not grow up to be an old mouse. But yet these children still believe that the mouse can still smell the flowers, maybe he's still thirsty, and he certainly still loves his mother. That's for certain.
Certainly.
So, and we looked at this across ages and in 2 different nations, the U.S. and Spain, in children who went to secular schools and children who went to religious schools. And though we found some differences, the children in religious schools were more apt to believe that that these feelings and emotions and cognitions continue after life. The pattern, developmental pattern, was pretty much the same. And it seems that there's not strictly a matter of what children are taught in their particular religion, but there's this tendency to, from at a very early age, to believe that, well, children are dualists. They believe the mind and the soul, or some aspects of it, continue after death. And this is part of a much larger set of theories and ideas about how people's ability, our wonderful ability to sort of read the minds of others, look for causes and what other people's behavior. Why did you do that? Why did you call me, Steve, at this time? And what might be on your mind? We always want explanations for things. How this theory of mind, as it's called, can lead to our wanting explanations for everything, including why the wind knocked over the tree in my backyard, or why the hurricane hit my neighbor but not me. And these natural phenomena are often explained by, they can't be explained by another person. It is easy to explain them in terms of some supernatural force. And in fact, some research we're doing now that with one of my students and some of my colleagues is looking at how adults view the immature statements of children. You might think they're cute. Sometimes the immature things kids say are just aggravating. As it turns out, when the immature things kids say have a supernatural or at least not a natural causation. The sun's not out today because it's angry. The mountain has big peaks for long walks and little peaks for short walks. These things adults find funny, or if not funny, at least endearing, and attribute positive things to children who express them. Whereas children who just show poor theory of mind, who can't help but blurt out an answer or overestimate their abilities, they don't necessarily view these things as positively. So even well-meaning adults, when viewing children's behavior, tend to have a little more positive perspective on things when there is some kind of supernatural causation to it. And we think this is related to the fact that adults never really grow out of this. We maybe educate ourselves out of this somewhat, but we're always looking for causes beyond ourselves, so to speak. And when children express these things, it's easier for us to feel positive about them.
So, wow. I have so many comments on that. The first comment, well, perhaps I'll save that question for the end, which is perhaps if you could speculate about why we might have this belief. And I'm working with a colleague here at GGC to think about that in a little bit deeper evolutionary terms. But you might know that my PhD supervisor was Gordon Gallup, who studied self-awareness in primates, and some colleagues go on to study child development, that sort of thing. And one of the things that he and I used to talk about a lot is that perhaps the belief in God or belief in a higher supernatural being comes from this natural. I mean, we never said it explicitly, but I like what you guys are doing and what Jesse's doing, this naturalistic belief that mountains have an intention, that we automatically apply intention, and from intention can beget belief. But one of the things that comes with a higher sort of order belief in a supernatural being could be perhaps this fact that we are death aware, right? And that the negative side effects of being self-aware is that we're death aware. And as a consequence, as an ancestral primate, I could see my kin or my conspecifics lying dead and contemplate not only that they are no longer part of my group, but that one day will happen to me.
Yeah.
And that cause, perhaps, I don't know what you think about that idea, but perhaps that idea of self-awareness and intentionality leading to this idea that, oh right, if that happened to them, that's going to happen to me. And it's much easier to perhaps psychologically contend with that information if you say it's okay if that happens to me because I'm going wherever it is you go in the afterlife, right?
Right. Well, I think there's certainly part of that, I think. Jesse, for example, Jesse Bering and I have the notion that in a sense you just can't help but think this way. You don't know what it's like to not exist. And so there's no notion of being without a mind, so to speak. And so it's very difficult to conceive of nothing. And so when we think of what happens after death, although we can understand the physical body dies,
right,
it's very hard to mentalize the mind that way, to think about that. We may think about nothingness, but when we think about nothingness, there's still an observer there to view it. On top of that, you've got the awareness of one's mortality, and I think it certainly makes it perhaps emotionally or existentially easier for one to envision an afterlife. And I think major religions take advantage of that. That this is something to give believers, and it's a very natural perspective. So some people view religion, for example, as a virus, as a culturally invented idea. And yes, religions are cultural, but they're based on a early developing intuitive notion of this reason, this cause in the universe. There's a reason for the big and little mountain peaks. There's a reason for everything. And we can't escape this, and then religion can be built upon this belief in this intentionality out there in the world. And since we can't attribute it all to people we know, we attribute it to people we don't know, and they can become our ancestors, our dead ancestors who are giving us messages, God or gods, or in some cases, it's just the universe. It's karma.
Sure.
But our fate is somehow governed by a higher power.
Now, would you agree that this process is perhaps a uniquely human process? And if so, why do you think that we have? I mean, one of the things that we're contending with, my colleague and I, is that belief seems really potentially adaptive for youngsters, right? I mean, I have a 1-year-old now, so he doesn't quite have this capacity yet. But I know when he's 3 and 4, I'm going to be able to convince him that a fat man in a red suit slides down the chimney and leaves presents under a tree.
Yes,
that doesn't grow inside, right? And he might even believe that when his tooth falls out, some fairy comes by and sneaks it out and leaves a quarter, or I guess inflation, it would probably be like a $10, right? And it's easy to dupe children into this belief. And one of the contentions that my colleague has come up with, his name is James Russell, he's a biology professor here, is that it's adaptive for children to believe, right? If you're hanging out in a society and your mom and dad say don't go to the river because there's, for lack of better reason, there's monsters in there and you will get eaten. Well, the child who doesn't have the automatic belief, sort of, I don't use the term module, but say brain mechanism, probably doesn't get eaten if he goes swimming, but he might get an infection, or he might slip and bang his head so in other words, other types of things could happen. But the idea that why does it persist? I mean, why does it persist into adulthood when we, I mean, lack of better term, we know better.
Well, we do and we don't.
Okay.
I think you're right on target there. And what you see, I think this is all part of our very advanced social cognition. we're the most social species there are. I guess if you want to exclude some ants and wasps or so, but depending
Yeah.
how you define them. But in terms of mammals, we're highly social. We're highly dependent on one another. And we are highly dependent on learning. And there's lots of ways to learn. You can learn by experience, trial and error, but humans, more so than any other species, learn via social mechanisms. We're not the only social species, of course, and apes do a lot of social learning, as you know, but they're not even close to us in terms of social learning abilities, in terms of imitation and explicit teaching. And one of the things we're finding now is that children beginning certainly by 3 years of age tend to, in imitation tasks, for example, imitate everything adults do, whether it's relevant or not. Some people are calling this over-imitation. One interpretation is that children view adults as dependable. Usually, if they tell you this is the way to do something, they show you there's a reason for it. Even if you've got to turn around 3 times and scratch your nose, that's what you do. As it turns out, when you would think this would disappear with age, but it doesn't. At least, if you have to turn around 3 times and scratch your nose, maybe an adult wouldn't imitate that. But if it's a potentially relevant type of behavior, the older you get, into young adulthood anyway, the more likely you are to just assume that if some authority figure demonstrates something, that's what you're supposed to do. It results in some errors. But in most cases, it's the most efficient way of doing things. We see this with using tools. How do you use a tool? Well, we'll watch someone use the tool and we'll do just what they do. When we learn what a tool is for, that's what we use it for. It gets us in trouble now and then. Functional fixedness. Nonetheless, most of the time it works. I think our dependence on social learning gives young children a bias to view adults as dependable people. We'll take their word for it, more or less, and do whatever they do, essentially. You see this somewhat in memory. Young children are easily swayed to remember things not quite as they actually happen. So there's high suggestibility. Well, when that person who's suggesting these things is a parent, it's probably worthwhile. And when we say suggestibility, there's some evidence that they changed not only their answers, they actually changed their minds. When you test them later on, this is what they really remember, they think. And these are viewed as errors. And, in a courtroom setting, it certainly is. But this dependence on social learning, at least for early on, may result in some of these errors or so-called errors. But most of the time, when your mother says to do something this way or tells you, no, that's not what happened, it was that way, there's probably going to be a good reason for it. She may not be right, but maybe she's going to keep you away from, the bog where, if not, the monster may not get you, but you could still fall in and get stuck. As we get older, we do get better at this, and so we don't imitate silly things, and we're not quite as susceptible to suggestion in memory situations, but we don't lose it. We're still a highly social species. We just get a little more skeptical now and then. And as kids get older, they also get a little more skeptical of people who don't give them good information. They get more discriminating. But their first bias is to essentially trust a newcomer. Okay. We'll see what you have to say. You're going to prove me wrong before I treat you skeptically. But their bias is to believe essentially in the goodness of strangers.
Wow. Yeah, and it's that's fascinating. I'm sure we could spend all afternoon talking about this, but you're doing some other research too. So why don't you tell me about some of your latest research that maybe doesn't bear on belief, and then maybe we'll shift gears and start talking about developmental psychology from an evolutionary perspective.
Okay, well, let me see. What are some of the things that we're doing? Well, I mentioned before we're looking at one of my graduate students finishing his PhD using what they call a dictator game. So in the dictator game, it comes from economics. You have in this case 10 stickers, very nice stickers, and you have another person you're playing with, and you just get to keep as many of those stickers as you want, or you can give some to this other person. And research has been done with adults and in other cultures for quite a while on this, and it turns out that we're not all that selfish. We do give things away. We keep most of the money for ourselves if we're an adult, or most of the stickers if we're a kid. But very few of those studies have actually used real people. They use hypothetical people. And so what Jason Grotus is the graduate student, and what he has is several conditions. The kindergarten, first and second graders, and one is sort of traditional. There's some other unnamed child in your classroom, and we're going to put the stickers you want to give to this child, whoever it will be, in this little box here. Another condition is two kids come into the room together, and one child leaves the room. So this child's not there. You can share stickers if you'd like with this other kid who's no longer physically present. And a third condition, both children are there, and so you've got to make your decision while facing the other child. And a fourth condition, the two children are there, and the potential recipient, hands each sticker individually to the child, who makes the decision, one sticker at a time. So will involvement make a difference? And then they get to switch roles later on, but we're quite aware of it. And what we find, it's probably not too surprising, but having someone physically present there does affect children's behavior. They are more altruistic, they share more. The second player, who was shared with or not shared with all that much, tends to give a little less than the first player did, but they're still quite correlated. There is reciprocity there. But you don't see these in large degrees anyway until first grade. Kindergarten children, a good portion of kindergarten children don't share anything. And the reciprocity isn't quite as strong among these 5-year-olds. So although in many other situations, 5-year-olds will share with one another, do understand reciprocity. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You give me stickers, I'll give you stickers. They don't do it as readily as children 6 or 7 years of age do. And we're not quite sure why, but we don't think it's empathy, but maybe better developed theory of mind, just to become more aware of social relationships.
Wow. Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask, if it's something about theory of mind. I just spoke with Daniel Nettle the other day, and he's recently published a paper about sharing, and showing that there's an interesting trade-off. His example is, if I have 3,000 calories of food, 2,000 calories will sustain me for one more day of life, and that additional 1,000 calories might not do me as much good as if I share with you, which might keep you alive. And even though that's not a selfish genetic principle as we think of, it's a selfish principle, because if you stay alive, that might help me stay alive, right? And so it's an interesting thing to see this developing in children who are and if you think of a naturalistic setting, are about the age of weaning, right? About the age where it's like, okay, start getting out of the tribe, start going out on your own and making friends. And even in westernized, in the so-called weird cultures, kindergarten is fine. Where I'm at, kindergarten is still a half a day situation, but first grade is it's a full-time job.
That's serious stuff.
Yeah, it's serious stuff. Get out there, and that's interesting intersection between a developmental age bracket or trajectory and that cognitive process. Now we talk about theory of mind. I have to ask you. I had a graduate student when I worked at the University of Liverpool, and he read a lot of your work on theory of mind, and a lot of, because we were in England, a lot of Simon Baron-Cohen's work on theory of mind. And the two models are not what some people would call congruent. Baron-Cohen's model is of a Tubian-Cosmedian modularity. I don't know if I can call it a Tubian-Cosmedian, but a massive modularity type of idea. Could you just give us a little bit of a summary of those two camps and where we stand in that literature?
Oh, there's probably more than two camps, but the Simon Baron-Cohen and the sort of the Tubian-Cosmedian perspective sees theory of mind as having, in Simon Baron-Cohen's view, 4 different types of modules that develop and that you see may see in other species. And the earliest ones, the intentionality one, someone is acting towards me. He's going to come and feed me, kiss me, hit me, whatever. And so we're very alert to that. And almost anyone with a nervous system should be, anything with a nervous system should demonstrate this to a certain extent. The next three are a little more sophisticated. The second one, Simon Baron-Cohen's, is the shared attentionality, I think, shared attention. And this becomes very critical, I think. It describes the behavior very nicely. The idea that when you have two people interacting with a third object, we can share attention. I can point out something to you, and I expect you will look at it. That sort of means that I don't think you see that, and if you're the observer, you understand that I don't think you see that. This is a very rudimentary notion of theory of mind. Mm-hmm. I understand that you have knowledge that may be different from mine, or vice versa. That's the third one, actually. The second one is the eye detection. The eyes have knowledge. That if I see something, I understand what that. If you're looking at something, you see that thing. You have knowledge of it. Then the fourth one is the theory of mind, which basically I understand that my behavior is driven by what I know and what I want, my beliefs and my desires. And then I also understand yours is as well, and they may be in conflict. And then you can get some real complicated mind games going on. I know that she knows that he thinks
right.
That Steve said.
Yeah.
So it can get very complicated there. So Baron-Cohen